Hi everybody, this week I'm going to try to make this cool snare drum. So my dad had a drum kit in the basement when I was a kid and I used to play with it all the time. And eventually he sold that kit, and when I got to high school, I kind of gravitated towards the tenor sax and played in the marching band and jazz band. But I always missed the drum kit, and now with a wood shop I figure why not make one? Especially when I've got some great options for tone woods that we can use for the actual drum. So luckily you can find a relatively inexpensive donor drum out on Amazon, and this one by Griffin was $49. But essentially all I'm really looking for is the hardware. But I'm also going to do a side-by-side sound comparison at the end of the video after we make our new drum, so stick around for that. Also, I'd like to ask you, if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. I appreciate it.
Just do it!
Hey, chill out, man. We're not that intense on this channel. But this is a pretty cheap entry-level drum, and so we're going to up its game with some of this really dense red African padauk. And this stuff is really hard. It's a great tone wood. It's used in the making of other musical instruments. And this is a nice and thick block, about 1 7/8 inches thick. So I'm going to keep all the thickness, but I'm going to cut originally 5.5-inch lengths, and then I'm going to cut these staves down to a little bit thicker than 3/4 of an inch. And I'm going to need 30 of these cutoffs. Now once I have my 30 pieces, I'm going to set my table saw blade angle to 6 degrees. And I'm going to have to make that 6-degree cut on both sides of every one of these staves. But they'll all roll up nicely into a perfect circle. And I want to give a shout out to woodturnersresource.com, because this is a great site for helping you figure cut angles and lengths if you're doing segmented turnings, or in this case, a drum shell. And once I've got everything squared up and lined up, I'm going to use some blue painter's tape on what would be the outer edge to the drum shell so that I can roll it up and get it ready for gluing. So in this particular case, I'm just testing it. And originally this is going to be a 14-inch snare drum shell, but ultimately I sized it so that it was wider than 14 inches because I knew I had to cut it down to make it round. So because padauk is a relatively oily hardwood, I used some acetone to get that oily residue off the edges before adding the Titebond 3 to all the joints. And now I'm relatively assured I'm going to get a strong glue up, especially using a couple of band clamps to pull the whole thing together into a circular form. And I had to do a little bit of adjusting to get all the staves to line up, but it looked really good. I got good squeeze out on all the joints. Now I had to make 2 separate jigs to allow me to turn this drum and make it round, to eliminate the flat spots on those staves so that the drum head would fit over the top. Now, these are my dimensions, 8x17 for this outer piece, because that fit on top of my router table. But your dimensions for these jigs are going to vary depending on the diameter of your drum and a couple of other factors. I set this up so that I could have a 1/2-inch threaded rod go through the center of these 2 pillow block bearings so that I could set the drum up with a squeeze down round clamp that I'm going to make myself, and that'll allow it to spin freely over the top of that router cutting blade. And so I'm going to need a couple of circle cutouts here that are just a little bit less in width than the outer dimensions of the shell. So I made these 2 plywood discs at 13.5 inches. And using some double-faced tape, I'm able to put those 2 plywood discs on both sides of the shell and then add some nuts and washers to squeeze both sides on top of the shell and now it'll spin freely over the top of my cutting head. What? Get back to work. And so it needed to be sanded so that it was flat before we did any additional work to it. And it looks like, after working with this wood, that I just cut up a side of beef. Insane. So you'll notice that I started working on a different color shell first. I made the first drum shell out of poplar just to test everything and make sure that it worked before I started to cut into the Padauk because it was significantly more expensive. But it worked out really, really well in just slowly turning it, adjusting the height of the cutting head a little bit at a time, and ultimately I took those square sections out of the drum shell and it turned out to be perfectly round. And so now while it's set up on the jig, it's easy to turn, so it's also easy to sand. Now the second jig, I needed to make something where the outer part of the shell could roll in a circle so that I could run a router on the inside part of the shell. So using these roller skate wheels, which came with bearings and some 1/2-inch aluminum tube as a spacer between the wheels, I set these up on some maple blocks that are lined up to raise the drum shell up off the surface by about 1/2 inch. And screwing these down now into the platform, everything's measured out, the drum shell turns freely. Now the trick is going to be, how do I get the router on the inside of this so that I can make it round? So just using some vinyl coated shelf material, it's got a little bit of a slippery surface to it so that I could glide my router up and down that channel. I also made another hinged arm that would go on top of the shell to kind of hold it down on those bottom wheels. And I'm going to add some weight to the arm to keep it in place while I slide my router through that sled. Now, one of the things I did wind up changing is I made a wider sliding table here for my bigger router. I tried using my small handheld battery-operated router, but the battery just didn't last very long. So this was a little bit more sustainable. I could turn the drum a little bit at a time and get the whole thing done after about 4 different passes. And with a little work here on the spindle sander, the inside was ready to go. Now the next thing I need to do is cut a bearing edge for the drum heads. And that is going to be a 45-degree taper on the outer part of the shell and a 30-degree taper on the inside of the shell, both sides. And you can see the tiny little taper on the outside and a 30-degree taper that goes much deeper on the inside. But I don't want a very sharp edge for the drum head, so I'm going to sand it down just a little bit to make sure it's perfectly flat. So now I needed a way to line up the drum mounts, and there's 8 of them, so it's easy enough to get a drawing of an octagon and sort of extend the line so that you've got equal spacing on the outer shell of the drum. And once I understood where these were going to go and they were measured out, I had to kind of prop up some material here on the drill press to support the drum head while I drilled those holes. And also had fun creating a little inlay for my shop logo. And that looks semi-professional. Semi-professional. And I wound up using some clear polyurethane finish on this because I really wanted it to be shiny, and it looks just wonderful. And now getting all the hardware lined up, this actually came together pretty well in the final assembly. Now, of course, this isn't the best quality hardware, but it was functional and it wound up doing a pretty good job holding the drum heads in place. And this bracket will be for the snare on the bottom of the drum. Now, I tried to tighten the heads to the same feel and the same tension as I got the original drum out of the box because I want to do a side-by-side comparison so that you can potentially hear the difference between the two drums. And so I did the best I could, and there is a noticeable difference with this tone wood shell. It came together just wonderfully, and the color looks fantastic. So, in all honesty, I've never tried to create a segmented structure like this anywhere near this big, but it just looks wonderful. This wood grain in the Padauk is beautiful, and it came out fantastic. Let's do the side by side. I really love the way this thing looks. It came out wonderful, and I can't wait to bang on it a little bit more. Thanks for watching, you guys.